Hey guys, my name is Kirsty and welcome back to Upside Down Books. Today we are going to be talking about non-fiction.
Non più tra I farfalloni amoroso, notte giorno di
Over the last month or so, I found myself becoming increasingly almost obsessed with non-fiction, and it's not a genre that I usually read very much, but I just picked up so many books in the last year and honestly within the last month that have just been really eye-opening and so fascinating, and it made me realize that there is so much to be learned from non-fiction and I want to read more of it. So today I want to share with you 5 non-fiction recommendations that I think you should read whether or not you read the genre, because they are so amazing at addressing different issues. We're going to be looking from personal issues all the way up to global and societal issues that these books are tackling, and if you give them a chance, I think you'll find you actually really like them. So I feel like I've accidentally got into non-fiction. I've gone down like the self-help book route, and then I've expanded once I've got there and branched into other non-fiction areas that I've just found really interesting. It's almost as if I've suddenly realized that you can actually learn things from books and they don't have to just be for entertainment, which is a strange realization to make. I've never set aside time previously to making the effort to read non-fiction to educate myself in something. I would usually read an article or watch a film or something like that, but never read a whole book because it seems like such a commitment. But these 5 books I'm about to talk about are game changers. So let's start with small and go out big. So the first one I want to talk about is one that I have talked about before, and that is Buy Yourself the Effing Lilies by Tara Schuster. So this is one of the self-help books that I've been really obsessed with, and I've gone through the whole thing and highlighted lines that really resonated with me. So this book is just a really great way of sort of taking a breather and looking at the bigger picture and not getting too obsessed with all the small things that can get you down. In particular, this is a really fantastic book to read if you're going through a breakup. It really helped me when I was going through a breakup, and it just has some really great life advice from Tara herself. Now, going into this, I had no idea who Tara Schuster is, but I believe several of you in the crowd tonight may know who she is. I think she's some sort of media celebrity. But this is just such a really easy to read book, and it's got a really candid voice to it with the things and the way that Tara is getting across her messages. It's not particularly long, it's got a fantastic title, and it is just all about getting up, doing it yourself, and stop waiting for things to happen to you. So it's sort of like taking back the reins of your own life, and she offers lots of different ideas of coping mechanisms, I guess, and ways to deal with certain issues, whether it's starting up journaling or putting post-it notes in certain places to just remind yourself that you're doing okay, and putting structures in place to deal with bad days and letting the bad days happen and move on. So if you're looking for something that's going to put you in a really good frame of mind and will be a really enlightening read, then I recommend you go and pick up this book because it is so well worth the read. Pretty much the rest of the books I'm going to talk about are going to be slightly heavier hitting topics, but I have really enjoyed them nonetheless, so let's crack on into them. The next one I want to talk about is A Life on Our Planet by David Attenborough. So I have loved this book and I've done a full review of it that you can watch here if you so desire. I went through this one and tabbed all of the scary and amazing statistics. You can, of course, watch the documentary that's available on Netflix if you want. There was lots of people who were angry about the fact that this was so negative, but it's a very bleak and honest look at the state of the planet. So this was a really good read and well worth reading, even if you have watched the documentary, because it just expands on some points, and all the research that he talks about is referenced at the very back of the book as well, so you can do further reading if you're so inclined to do so. And there's also pictures in here, which is kind of nice. David Attenborough's just such a wonderful man. I think so many of us have grown up with him and his documentaries, and it was a little bit of a shock for him to do something so serious and so hard-hitting. It almost felt like he was betraying your childhood nostalgia in a way, but I think it was needed, and it's the most brutal version of climate change that I have encountered so far. When I finished reading this, I became really inspired to read further and wider on this topic, and it was probably one of the books that's really tipped me into this need to consume more non-fiction. So I have this whole list on Goodreads that I keep now that I'm hoping to get around to eventually, to read more non-fiction on climate change in specific areas and from different expert voices. So if you haven't read this or watched the documentary, then you really should. This is really important. And there is a more hopeful part at the back. It's very depressing to start with, but when you get towards the conclusion of the book, Attenborough does offer some more positive notes in places of the world where we have been doing well, and sort of using those as good examples of the way that the rest of the world should follow. So definitely go and get yourself a copy of this or watch the documentary if you haven't yet. The next book I want to talk about is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I have just finished reading this one and it was phenomenal as expected. This is obviously dealing with the huge issue of racism, and I think it has been really well done. I think because Edo Lodge has done a really good job of mixing up like personal anecdotes with facts and figures, that it's really quite an impactful read, and it's a really good way of actually explaining and defining what white privilege is and what racism is, because there are so many sort of old definitions of those concepts that I think if you haven't put a lot of active thought into reflecting on what those things mean, those old definitions of them don't quite capture the actual concepts themselves. So this is actually quite a short and quick read to get through, and I definitely think that everybody should be reading this. I just think it's a really good way of holding yourself accountable to be like, well, how am I contributing to this and how am I not helping? And definitely leaning into the idea that racism is a structural and systematic issue, and therefore there needs to be a little bit more active effort into restructuring that problem. One of my favourite chapters included the topic on feminism, and that was obviously looking at white feminism versus what feminism should be, and I thought that that was really good because that's not something I've actually read about before, like how problematic white feminism is when it's not inclusive of anyone other than a white woman. So it is really, really interesting to read this book, and if I think it really is just some required reading if you want to be a human being. It is a good first look and first step into this problem, and there are so many other things out there that you can read to expand your knowledge on this topic. Speaking of feminism, the next book I want to talk to you about is one I also finished recently, and that is Women and Leadership by Julia Gillard and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. These are two leading women. Julia Gillard is a former Prime Minister of Australia, which was why I was originally interested in this one, because she's done some really interesting things around the topic of sexism and misogyny, etc. And she's a really famous misogyny speech. If you have never heard her give that speech, especially if you're not Australian, then I recommend you jump on to YouTube. I mean, you're already on YouTube, but open a new tab and look up Julia Gillard's misogyny speech and just enjoy that beautiful, beautiful speech. But this was really interesting to read. It's quite overwhelming to go through it and realize how much of an issue sexism still is, and I certainly think it's something that's worthwhile reading just to kind of remind yourself that you don't have to just make do, and you don't have to fit in, and you don't have to put up with certain behaviour from men or even other women as well, and that you can challenge the status quo there and expect more and demand more. But if anything, I found one of the most amazing things that came out of this book was reading about other women's stories. So the premise of this book is that Julia and Ngozi have interviewed, I think, 8 other leaders. Yeah, 8 other leaders. They're listed on the cover here, as that includes like Jacinda Ardern, Hillary Clinton, Theresa May, and other really prominent women who have had varying degrees of hard times being in a leadership position. Jacinda Ardern is everyone's favourite, I think. New Zealand Prime Minister, if you're not aware somehow. She is just such an amazing role model, and she had a child in office, which is just an incredible feat of accomplishment. And the way that they talk about their experiences and the different ways that they have made it to the top is really, really interesting. So it's broken up into 8 different hypotheses about sexism, and by interviewing these 8 women, they bring in, Julia and Ngozi bring in their perspectives on each of those 8 hypotheses, and sort of offer up ways that we could tackle problems to make things a little bit better for women. So this is a really, really great read, and I would definitely recommend picking this one up. So that brings me to my final book that I want to talk about, and I mentioned this one in my previous wrap up, and that was In Control: Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder by Jane Monckton Smith. So this one is obviously very serious and probably as important as it is for people to read, probably not a read for everyone, just because some of these topics I'm sure will be very triggering. So if you don't want to hear about this one, then just end the video here because it's the last thing I'm going to talk about. But if you do, then stay tuned. But this one is talking about domestic violence and homicide, and in particular it is talking about femicide. And Monckton Smith is an ex-policewoman who worked in the homicide squad, and she has done loads of research into patterns of behaviour to try and explain how domestic violence works, why people don't leave, whether it's the abuser or the victim, like what that kind of mentality is, and understanding what it all means and how to identify it. So again, I think this is another 8-step, yes, this is another 8-step how-to guide almost, where Monckton Smith has identified the 8 stages that lead up to homicide. And obviously in a lot of domestic violence cases, the abuser does not go all the way to 8, and it might just sort of, you know, they might cycle between 1 and 5 or 1 and 4 or whatnot, but that's still very damaging, obviously. And it's got a lot to do with control, as the title would suggest. So what Monckton Smith has done is she's gone around and she's interviewed a lot of victims who have survived and victims' families for those who did not survive. And she's also interviewed the murderers themselves, which was absolutely fascinating. And she's very, very good at doing it. Very, very good. So when she goes into the jails and she speaks to these murderers, the answers and the attitude she gets from them is just fascinating. And she does it in a way where she's not provoking any sort of reaction or answer. She's mostly just letting them speak to see what they offer her. And they very much so seem to lean on the victim card themselves, believing that the other person pushed their buttons and they had no choice but to kill them, and what else did anyone expect? This book is brilliant for challenging that attitude of being, you know, a red mist coming down or someone just snapping, because it's very, very rare when that's a legitimate reason why someone has killed someone. They are almost always premeditated, and there is almost always signs as to when this happened. It doesn't just happen randomly. So this is an absolutely fantastic book to read. It's really eye-opening, and I think if you're interested in ever being in a relationship with somebody, it's just a good book to read to be aware. And even if it's not applicable to you because you're in a really good relationship, I think it's good to be aware for friends and family and for being able to identify those patterns of behaviour in other people. So I cannot recommend this book enough. It's very short to read and it's a new release for 2021. So make sure you go and check this one out if you're interested, because it really is eye-opening and it really is groundbreaking in my opinion. So those are the 5 non-fiction books that I am recommending to you today. I think this is a really wonderful genre and I think there is so much to be taken from it, as you can see just from these 5, including Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. There is such a really, really broad range of topics that you can explore in non-fiction, and then you can use those as stepping stones for topics that you find particularly interesting to explore more. I think it's a really good thing to do. I think we should always be challenging ourselves to learn more and to try some different genre, different reading in our usual reading patterns, so that we can have more interesting conversations with people and just be more aware of all the things that are happening in the world. So let me know in the comments down below if you think you might pick up any of these, or if there's any interesting books on these topics that you can recommend to me. I would love to know, but other than that, I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.